begin this presentation on myofascial lines with the superficial back line, which begins on the plantar surface of the toes, goes up the calcaneus, up the condyles of the femur, up the hamstrings, up to the erector spinae, up to the occipital ridge, and all the way to the frontal brow ridge. So essentially, it connects the entire posterior body. So the overall postural function of the superficial back line is to support the body in full extension and to prevent unwanted flexion, which is curling over. So it essentially keeps you upright. So in order to do this, it uses these extra heavy sheets and bands in the fascial portion, such as the plantar fascia, in your Achilles tendon, hamstrings, sarcotubular ligament, the cables of the erector spinae, such as those things. It's responsible primarily for extension of the back and hips, and is responsible for flexion of the muscles below the knees. Our next one is the superficial frontal line. So it begins on the dorsal surface of the toes, up the tibial tuberosity, past the patella, up the quadriceps to the iliac spine, then begins at the pubic tubercle, up the rectus abdominis, the fifth rib, up the sternal mambrium, to the sternocleidomastoid, into the mastoid process. So functionally, the SFL and the SBL oppose each other. The superficial back line being responsible for flexing the toes, and the superficial front line being responsible for extending them, and so on in the rest of the body as well. So the overall postural function is just to balance out the superficial back line and provide tensile support to lift parts of the skeleton up, which extend past the gravity line, such as the pubis or the rib cage. And the movement that this is primarily responsible for is flexion of the trunk and hips and extension of the knee. So flexion of the trunk and hips and extension of the knee and dorsiflexion of the foot as well. So dorsiflexion of the foot. The spiral line begins at each side of the skull, and it crosses the thoracic spine to the back, the opposite shoulder. It then goes down the chest to the front of the navel and goes down the hip. From the hip, it goes down to the outside of the foot, so all the way down your leg to the outside of your foot. The spiral line is responsible for stability in all directions. Not only this, it's responsible for maintaining posture during twists or rotations, and it's also responsible for creating those twists or rotations. So it would be responsible for motions such as this. So creating those and keeping me stable during them. Next line that we're talking about is the lateral line. And the lateral line begins at both the medial and lateral sides of the foot, goes up the fibularis muscle, up the iliotibial tract, to the gluteus maximus, to the lateral abdominal obliques, to the external and internal intercostals, to the sternocleidomastoid, and up to the occipital ridge. And so what it's mostly responsible for posture-wise is stability both in the sagittal and the coronal planes. Another one of its functions is that it mediates forces among the other lines. So mostly does this for the limbs while the upper body is acting. It stabilizes the limbs and helps with stabilization in the other lines. For movement, it's mostly responsible for lateral bend, such as this, and acceleration when perpendicular to gravity, so acceleration there, and deceleration when standing, so when coming back up. It's also responsible for foot eversion and for hip abduction as well, so hip abduction. So now we're going to be talking about functional lines. And before I describe to you how they're different than the other lines we've been talking about, I'd first like to describe the structure. So to begin with the front, we start at the shaft of the humerus, down the pectoralis major, to the pubic tubercle and symphysis, to the adductor longus, and linea aspera of the femur. And that's mirrored on both sides. Now for the back, you begin at the shaft of the humerus. You go down the latissimus dorsi to the sacrum, across the gluteus maximus, to the shaft of the femur, to the vastus lateralis, and eventually into the tuberosity of the tibia. And so yeah, that's just the structure. How it differs in function from the other lines is that it is not really engaged or active during passive posture. So when you're standing there still and not moving at all, it's hardly used, these functional lines. They more so come into play outside of standing posture, and they're actually really strong stabilizers outside of posture. One example of this is, say, during a yoga pose or any sort of work that required you to stabilize the upper girdle to the trunk. So say you're holding something above your head, and you're trying to stabilize your upper girdle to your trunk, and you're trying to transfer that stability upwards or the strain downwards. That's one of the times when it can be used. Another use of this is, and actually its primary use, is during athletics, or where precision and power are needed, such as during kick, say for soccer. As you go to kick, the left portion, like your left shoulder and your left arm, go out, and your right leg goes back. And so essentially you're making a much longer lever arm than you had before, and with that longer lever arm you can get a greater velocity on your leg, a greater velocity and a greater range of motion at the price of mechanical advantage, but in this case we prefer the velocity. So essentially, yeah, it's just using the counterbalance that can be provided by this, by its contralateral counterpart. You can generate lots of force for a kick. Yeah, and so that's just primarily what the function of the functional lines are and how they're different from the other lines.